Welcome to After the Homily. I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. Have you ever had questions after the homily? Have you ever wished that you could sit down with Father and talk about all of those things that you felt like should have made it into the homily but didn't quite make it on the scene that day? Well, this is the podcast for you. We cover everything from literature to politics, church teaching to church architecture. And it doesn't matter if you're an everyday or a Christmas and Easter, or maybe you can't even remember the last time you went to Mass type of Catholic. We're here for you. This podcast is for you. I'm joined today by Father Daniel Schiedt, the pastor at St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Father Dan,
Great
welcome.
to be here, Chris.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. Since the last time we spoke, a lot of things have happened in the world Catholic.
Habemus Papam. We have a pope.
We do. Praise God.
A new one.
We do. So much has happened in a relatively compact period of time.
Yes. And I happened to be in the Chicagoland area at Mundelein Seminary at some ongoing formation. And it was there in the midst of all of these priests from around the country that we received the news that Leo the 14th is the newest successor of Peter.
That must have been an exciting place to be to hear
It
that.
It was amazing. And even stranger is when I phoned my parents later, my dad, who worked on electrical meters when I was growing up, that was his profession, he had Dalton, Illinois as his territory.
Oh.
So the Prevost family, the family from which Pope Leo hails, that's their home, Dalton, Illinois.
Wow.
And my mom said that her cousin Bonnie lives in the Pope's neighborhood. So just the universality of the church as it played out in just the intimacy of my own family, it heightened even more the amazement at this being a pope who has American citizenship.
My announcement experience was probably not as formal as yours, but it was midday, so I was in my office and I was watching the news feeds, and I have to admit I lost track of time because it was sort of all-encompassing, even though nothing was happening, just a lot of anticipation. And then finally we saw the new pope, and it was time to get back to usual work. And I realized I was an hour behind schedule. I said, why didn't someone tell me? And they said, we didn't think you'd want to be bothered in such an important...
Yes, it's amazing. Oh. And I never cease being awestruck that when you think of how a fisherman who died on the Vatican Hill thousands of years ago for declaring that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and he's the Lord of the universe. The fact that literally the whole world would be looking to Vatican Hill to see who's going to come out of that building that was built over the grave of Peter of Galilee.
Twice, right.
Yeah. And that this would be somebody who would embody the universality of Christ's love for all the nations. The fact that people from all over the world wouldn't just be tuning in, but would actually be gathering in St. Peter's Square, and then really no matter who is announced, there's this eruption of joy that we have a pope.
Yeah, it was exciting. I got a sense, too, when you said universality, there are many Protestant commentators, some well-known Christian Protestant commentators talking about how important this is. It's 1.5 billion, of the world's Christians. And it did give me that sense of this is big.
Yes, and leading up to the election of Pope Leo, I would have people, some of them not Catholic, coming up to me saying that they're praying for this, and they're really hopeful that the world has a leader who can really bring people together.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me was just the living historical sense that I can say I remember what I was doing when this pope, was announced, because as young as he is, relatively speaking, maybe like St. John Paul, he would likely be the pontificate for my the remainder of my life.
Yes. In fact, his namesake, Leo the 13th, was elected, I believe, when he was 68 years old, 68 or 69, and then reigned until he was 93. So he was one of the longest-lived popes. But I thought something similar. So please God, I have 20 more years in active ministry before I'm able to retire. Not that I would want to retire, but but Pope Leo could very well serve the church for another 20 years.
That was certainly true of St. John Paul. I mean, many people, it was the only pope they'd known.
Exactly.
So it is an exciting, and to feel like we were participating and watching that event. I remember where I was when Pope Benedict stepping down was announced. These things stick into your head.
Indeed.
But it's an exciting thing to witness.
Yes. And I was particularly moved that his background is so rich. Obviously, growing up in the United States, entering a religious community, the Augustinians. Mm-hmm. So that's an ancient monastic order. And then the time that he spent serving in the leadership of that community and was elected twice by his confreres. So he had the vote of confidence that he's capable of listening to everyone and making wise decisions for the good of all. And then when Pope Francis named him a bishop, and he worked all of those years in Peru, first as a priest and then as a bishop. So he knew and knows from within multiple cultural experiences to the point of also being a naturalized citizen of Peru. And the fact that he also was asked by Pope Francis to be head of the dicastery for bishops, so he would be the one helping to go through the discernment process of bishops from around the world. And again, we just, I think sometimes as Catholics, we can just take for granted that, there are several thousand, a little over 4,000 bishops in the world. But it's astonishing. So when Christ gave the Great Commission to the first apostles, go teach all nations, that's actually instantiated in the Catholic Church. And so the shepherds from around the world are serving the flock of Christ and also need to be discerned for who's going to take on these responsibilities for the next generation. So the fact that the future Leo the 14th had that administrative experience and also just the personal back and forth with bishops' conferences from around the world, in addition to having a canon law degree, a doctorate in canon law, he actually knows the value of legislation and of the ordering of life. So I think looking back on the decision, I don't know which factors would have influenced which cardinals in which ways, but the fact that the College of the Cardinals could arrive relatively swiftly at a consensus, a majority that would elect Leo, I think that bodes really well for the future of the Church.
And I don't remember in the days leading up to the announcement, I don't remember him being listed by the talking heads that often.
No.
There are plenty of other names, many Italians and others, but I don't recall him being listed, which is kind of interesting.
And that the point hardly needs to be stated, but let's just state it. For whatever political dimensions may be operative in any discernment of any type of leadership, the fact that the process is structured so that it's not a question of political lobbying. And the cardinal electors who go into the Sistine Chapel, many of them didn't know each other very well, but they know their ecclesiastical situation quite well. They're shepherds. And the fact that they could come to an agreement on exactly the points that I enumerated for why this particular pope has many, many gifts, I just think that's a sign of health for the church.
What we've seen now 3 papal changeovers, one might say. What do you think it means for the church in these immediate days? I wonder if it's a feeling of change, if it's a feeling of continuing along, keeping the doors open, so to speak. I wonder what that feeling is like inside the inside area of the Vatican.
Yes, I think at a basic level, Leo's initial decisions to return to various elements of just ordinary papal life that were either put to the side or deliberately chosen an alternative to those by Pope Francis. I think the fact that he's going back to the ordinary way of doing things, I actually think is reassuring. And I'll just give you one example. And I know that this is talked about from all sorts of angles to pit one person against the other, but how I present this is as important as the substance of it. So the so-called apostolic palace,
which apparently is not a palace at all, correct?
Well, the place where the Pope lives, there are palatial aspects to it, and I might as well just give the historical footnote that the word palace derives from a particular hill of Rome, one of the 7 hills of Rome, the Palatine Hill. And on the Palatine Hill is where the emperors used to live. And so to have a palatial home was actually more of a geographical indicator rather than
opulence, maybe.
Opulence, right. In fact, the Emperor Augustus made a big point of having a very simple home on the Palatine. In any case, the apostolic palace has been built over the years to accommodate the exercise of the Petrine ministry by the Pope and his closest advisors. So it's actually not just where the Pope's bedroom is going to be, but it's actually an arrangement of all sorts of rooms, including offices, of the people who are going to be of most assistance to the Holy Father. And this is a really interesting question. So, for example, John Paul II, when he was Pope and lived in the Apostolic Palace, he brought a congregation of Polish religious sisters to form the papal household. So they were his spiritual family. They took care of him. He would, relax in the company of this group of people. They would pray with him in the morning. And with Pope Benedict, there was a shift. So he continued to live in the Apostolic Palace, but instead of living with religious sisters, he lived with women of a lay movement, Communion and Liberation, an Italian lay movement. And these women weren't religious sisters. They were consecrated virgins, some of them with very distinguished academic backgrounds, but they too formed the papal family. They provided just human support so that the Pope wasn't just surrounded by business all day. In the case of Pope Francis, he deliberately chose to live not in the Apostolic Palace, but in the hotel that John Paul II designed to welcome the cardinal electors after the Pope's death so that they could have a simple, decent, up-to-date place to live. Because for the election of John Paul II, some of the cardinal electors who are of a certain age were given cots and
I've heard that story.
all sorts of improvised lodging. But the explanation that Francis gave for living in the hotel rather than the Apostolic Palace was he said he did it for motivi psicologici, psychological motives, because he wanted a different style of community. His personality lent itself more toward the hotel, people coming and going. Mm. But it also reflected a certain inability to form a papal household. And so what wound up happening is you had all sorts of advisors of his just take the rooms on the second floor of the hotel. And after Francis's death, of course, all the papal rooms are sealed, and it created the problem that the very rooms that were designed to be used for the cardinal electors,
place to put the cardinals,
they had to go into some different places. Not everybody could be accommodated in the hotel. Mm-hmm. My point in bringing this up with Leo is that by returning to the rooms that were designed to be used in a certain way for the Pope to have an ordered life and kind of papal household, a papal family, that is actually allowing a certain ordering of responsibilities that is less idiosyncratic and more focused on just what's needed for a certain level of collaboration. Yeah. And I should also point out a funny historical footnote that this switching of rooms is not actually merely a modern phenomenon. So Pope Pius X is the one who moved into the uppermost floor of the Apostolic Palace, where the popes currently have their lodging, and that used to be the servants' quarters. So all the way back, beginning of the 20th century, Pius X wanted to send a message that he wanted to live in simpler rooms, and he's the one who outfitted the rooms that Leo XIV will live in.
And if anyone has ever had a chance to tour the museum, you walk through some of the magnificent rooms with some of the most famous paintings in the world, and they are previous papal apartments.
The hallways are really nice, but the actual rooms where, for example, where the Pope sleeps are very, very simple. And I would actually invite our listeners, do a little internet research about, because there are photos of the different papal bedrooms. So you can see how each pope practically lived. And at least the popes in recent memory live actually very, very simple personal lives. Wow. I really think the people of God would be edified to see the simplicity with which, let's just say, the popes of the 20th century.
It must be for lack of a better word, a bizarre lifestyle. I'm thinking they're never actually off, and who they choose to surround themselves with would be sort of a tool to maintain sanity.
Yes.
I know John Paul was famous for his lunches where he just surrounded himself with interesting people and friends, and you could see that as being relaxing and restorative.
Yes.
But they must struggle for anything that resembles private, normal time.
Yes, and for this ministry to be sustainable, they actually have to attend to some basic personal things. And for Benedict, he had a piano, and he'd play the piano with his friends. He was also a scholar, and he would invite all of his former doctoral students once a year to come, and they would have a few days of a seminar, and they would talk over the ideas of church and world. And Francis significantly didn't take vacations. Typically, the papal summer residence, Castel Gandolfo, was turned into a museum. The upside of the Pope actually taking vacation is that it helps the local economy. And so I'm sure the people of the little town of Castel Gandolfo will be very interested to see how much time Pope Leo chooses to spend there, because the truth is, the more time he spends there, the more the local economy is helped, and the more people can actually make a livelihood.
I'm sure. That's the other impression that I had is, I believe he's 69, but he seems much younger.
Yes.
I mean, he seems very fit and, very active. I wonder if he'll travel a lot. St. John Paul was famous for his travel. I think the most traveled pope. I wonder if he will be a traveling pope. I got that feeling.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think the number of pressing issues that need to be attended to closer to home might keep him home more than one would think.
Competition for time must be
the Vatican finances, et cetera. And I don't know. It's an open question in my mind. I don't know whether we need a globe-trotting pope. And my initial impression of Leo is that he's much less a personality. In the case of John Paul II, his personality was epic in a certain sense, but at the same time, it was actually the tip of the iceberg from this hidden contemplative depth of prayer. And one had the sense that whenever he appeared in public, he was just sharing what he had received in just hours and hours of hidden prayer. With Benedict, he really wasn't a personality, but at the same time, he had very specific creative theological gifts. One thinks of the trilogy, Jesus of Nazareth, that he wrote, and that was how he expressed his personality, so to speak, at the service of the Petrine ministry. And Francis sought to use the bold gesture, the going to the prison on Holy Thursday to wash the prisoners' feet.
Right.
And those gestures, they moved many people very deeply. I get the impression that Leo wishes to make an impression by attending to the things that his predecessors weren't able to attend to as fully as they would have hoped. I mean, each pope, for example, John Paul, Benedict, Francis, has inherited a financial mess. And I actually think there are progressive improvements that are made in that area, but the Vatican actually is facing critical financial issues, and those are going to require sooner rather than later more attention.
Wow. Yeah, it was said, I heard from people much smarter than I, that, for all of his gifts, St. John Paul, maybe administration was not something that he liked the most. We need different leaders at different times.
Exactly, exactly. And I think John Paul saw the necessity of personal presence where the affirmation of Peter was needed in the world. And there were just so many things in the church in the 60s into the 70s that were just in free fall.
Yeah.
And the fact that John Paul attended to those so personally and directly is beautiful. The fact that John Paul and Benedict collaborating together really consolidated the theological implementation of the Second Vatican Council, for example, in developing the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's a tremendous gift to the Church, and we're still reaping the good fruits of it, for example, in all of the resources that are available for really anyone who's interested and has internet access or knows the good publishers to draw on the riches of the Catholic faith. And my hope is that Leo XIV, being an Augustinian, will be able to draw on the riches of the fathers of the Church, specifically St. Augustine, to offer more of the fruits of the living roots of the faith.
What are some of the common traits or charisms of that order? Because it's not one that we hear about necessarily that often.
Yes, it's quite ancient. So Augustine lived just as the Roman Empire was collapsing, and he was a bishop basically in Podungsville. Podungsville has a name, Hippo, in northern Africa, what's now, I believe, Algeria. And Augustine very consciously drew together his priests. They lived a common life, so the communal life. And so many of Augustine's homilies, his literary output, was the fruit of living this common life. So the Augustinians today really carry on the theological and spiritual legacy of St. Augustine, everything from his homilies to his autobiography, the Confessions, to his great work, The City of God, on the relation between the church and the world. And I hope that Leo is able to draw on all of that richness in bringing that discernment to what our world needs. When he gave an intervention at a synod on evangelization, so this was, I forget what year it was, but it was under Pope Benedict. It was very interesting that he chose to focus on understanding the rhetoric of the secular culture, how hostile it can be, and also developing a rhetorical response that doesn't simply mirror the secular culture. So it's actually going beyond just using mass media. So they're putting up these sound bites, these memes, these visuals. We're going to put up these, and we're going to battle that way. But his insight is much more profound. It's that we actually have to share the fullness of our life, the integrity of our life, in a new way. I mean, I like to think that this podcast is a way of communicating in a longer form way than just a gesture or a sound bite.
Yeah.
Like communicating in a more extended way using a very new evangelizing format. So my hope is that, just as St. Augustine, who was a master of rhetoric, actually used a new form, and some would even argue developed the form of the autobiography, not just narrating external deeds like famous people would, but actually sharing his interior life. It would be my hope that Leo would develop the voice and the visuals to do it in a way that isn't so centered on his personality. I think his humility is going to be exercised in a different way than we've seen it exercised.
That's interesting. I have not heard that said. That's an interesting perspective.
I'm also, one other thing that I've never heard in all of the commentary, but let this podcast be the first. To all of our Lutheran listeners out there, and I hope there are many, I am so thrilled and intrigued at the possibility that this Augustinian friar priest would be able to draw on the roots of the great tradition to further heal the divisions from the time of another Augustinian friar priest by the name of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was from the religious order that Cardinal Prevost was the superior of.
Wow.
And I
So maybe there's some ecumenical opportunities there.
Yeah, because Lutherans would have a very special, profound connection to the thought of St. Augustine, just because Luther drew deeply on that. Obviously, rejected various elements of what he had received, but I think it provides some very deep, very living starting points for seeing how the Lord can heal this division that is now more than a half millennium old.
And certainly it sometimes, I know in my life, it seems like the crazier the world gets, the less divided maybe we become.
Oh, it's true.
Because our commonality becomes easier to see.
Yes.
When outside the room, the world is sort of losing touch.
And it's not just the enemy of the enemy is my friend. It's actually not just that superficial bond that can be created from having a common opponent, but it's actually forcing, in this case, Catholics and Lutherans, it's forcing all of us to study more deeply what the good that we share is, what the truth that we share is. And I just think that the late Father Richard John Newhouse, who was a Lutheran minister who became a Catholic priest and founded a group called Catholics and Evangelicals Together, I can't help but think that initiative to study and articulate what we share most deeply in common for the healing of these wounds is going to find a great friend in Leo XIV.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking about some of my own work in matters of life. We started talking with our evangelical brothers and sisters, and particularly our Lutheran brothers and sisters. We are so in step.
Yes.
And to make a list of the things on which we agree, it's a much, much larger list.
Yes.
Than the things that we think we disagree on. So that is encouraging to think that way.
Indeed.
Thinking about Pope Leo, and you had referenced personality, where do you think he falls on the classic introvert, extrovert sort of continuum?
Oh, that's a really good question, to which I do not have an adequate answer, except to say that I've been very astonished and deeply moved at how confident and peaceful he seems already in the exercise of his Petrine ministry. Whenever he comes on the scene and has to deliver a speech or give a blessing, he doesn't shrink from it. Oh. He doesn't hog all the attention to himself in a narcissistic way. But he just strikes me as somebody really comfortable in his own skin.
One would have to be. I was thinking mathematician, but canon lawyer, different parts of the brain. That
yes.
doesn't exactly.
One of his confreres, his Augustinian friends, described him as having the mind of Benedict, the heart of Francis, and the missionary program of John Paul II. And if that confrere is correct, I think we have some very blessed days ahead of us.
Wow.
But what I like about that observation is that it underlines the fact that there's no cloning. We actually shouldn't want a clone of any of the popes. The Lord creates the diversity of persons and missions precisely like a body has all sorts of different organs, so that working together, the whole can live and thrive.
I almost thought earlier you were going to start a list of important things that Pope Leo must take on. You referenced Vatican finances. What are the other top things on that list, do you think?
Well, I haven't yet been consulted, but just in case, just in case anybody tunes in at the Apostolic Palace after the Homily podcast, I would love to see a series of encyclical letters, so letters that circulate to the whole church, drawing on the Augustinian tradition of just Augustine's greatest works. So, for example, his Confessions, I would love to see an encyclical on theological anthropology. So what does it mean for the human person to be fully alive in Christ? And just to draw on the riches that Augustine began to explicate. And then his other great work, City of God, an encyclical on the relationship between the church and the world, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, on teaching, to clarify some of the recent ambiguities in magisterial teaching. And then I'm sure that Leo the 13th will 14th will build on the teaching pontificate of Leo the 13th, who not only revived the study of St. Thomas Aquinas, but also developed what's now known as the Church's social teaching about labor and how governments exist to serve the thriving of human beings. And Leo the 13th offered a very powerful critique of communist ideas that were then emerging, but also a critique of kind of freewheeling, exploitative capitalism that was dog eat dog. And I just think that these teaching priorities are going to get a lot of buy-in and support from people who have grown weary of the factional hatreds and the ideological polarization.
Oh.
And I just think if your starting point is, well, is this Pope liberal or conservative? It's just a non-starter. And I think the more that Leo emphasizes the great tradition which serves the gospel, I think to that extent he's going to be challenging everyone and actually encouraging everyone in what goodness particular groups can contribute to the good of the whole.
I hope they call you. I think they should.
We shall see.
You could help them. I'm sure you would be beneficial.
I'm happy that we're doing this podcast because it's like scattering seeds. Whoever tunes in, whatever the Lord does with it, it's great.
We talked about the universality of the church, and as a relatively new Catholic, 2007, I'm still sometimes taken aback by the bigness and the universality of the church. I mean, just something as simple as traveling to another town and going to Mass in a strange place. And the minute we walk in, it isn't strange at all. It's home.
I know.
You don't maybe recognize the faces, but the same people.
Yes.
There's just that familiarity of I'm in a place that exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Exactly. And at St. Vincent's, we've for the Easter season, we sing the Regina Caeli.
Yes.
Queen of Heaven, rejoice, Alleluia, for he whom you merited to bear, Alleluia, has risen as he said, Alleluia. That ancient Gregorian chant. So we've been singing it throughout the Easter season, and just for our school kids who are learning this new hymn, for them to see the successor of Peter after he gives his blessing on Sunday in his own voice, just in tone, Regina Caeli letare.
That was beautiful.
That it indicates to these little kids growing up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that literally what they're singing is part of a greater song that's meant to be sung around the world and in every generation. And what the Pope serves is not himself, his own ideas, his own personality. What he serves is Christ and something greater than himself. And in doing that, that's where he reveals what true Christian greatness is.
Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. It's hard to improve.
And we've just begun.
Well, viewers, we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion of our new Holy Father. We hope that you'll listen to this podcast and share it with every single person that you know, even especially, I should say, maybe our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. What a great way to evangelize. Like and subscribe. That helps us keep bringing content to you. If you'd like to contact us, you can. church@stv.org. We'd love to hear what you think about this podcast, Be Gentle, or what you think about future topics that you would like us to cover. But again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back again soon with another episode of After the Homily.